We'll talk about the trail construction phases and a little bit in depth about what kinds of projects work well for different kinds of processes that we can use. We'll talk about hiring a contractor, and we'll do that specifically in Canada. Canada is very specific and different from a lot of other Commonwealth nations because of some cases that happened within the last 50 years or so. And it has some ramifications for people who do expect to hire people either as an agent of a land management agency or as a representative for a trail association. We'll talk about different considerations of the process as we go through it, and then some very hypothetical examples of different ways projects can be structured. And then I hope that we can have a good conversation about or a question and answer period as well about all the challenges that you might have depending on your region or contractors that you're working with, or different agencies that you might be trying to engage as you go through the consultation process. So generally, the trail construction can be broken down into three main categories. And a fourth, I guess, would be maintenance as well. That can be something that's included, but that's fairly easy to accommodate within this list. Each one of these, while they're broken down into these categories, this is only for convenience. You can buy these services in any way that you'd like to based on how you structure the statement of work. But generally, master planning, not only does it involve coming up with an idea of where are my trails going to go, it's really concerned with who. It's who is going to use those trails. What does the terrain look like? How do we balance who with the stakeholders that we have? And so an understanding of detailed user groups, hearing what it is that they have to say about the area that you're looking to contract in. Visioning is a really specific facilitated period where you're discussing what you would like to see your community look like, say in 5-10 years time, and how we get there. And at the end of master planning, and of course, again, this is a totally arbitrary line drawn in the sand, is a broad concept plan. So this is as a breakdown, maybe using polygons on a map that says one of these here, one of those there, this much of this, probably maybe based on some basic assumptions when it comes to how much and how far. And then a detailed design. This is where we're ground truthing all of the specific components that maybe they were laid out in the master plan, maybe there is no master plan, and you just want to buy a trail, and the detailed design is where that happens. And that can be with a desktop investigation. If you've got high quality data, you can do a fair amount, or at least you can eliminate a fair amount, which significantly shortens the amount of time that you would spend in phase B, which is field layout. This is where we're ground truthing. We're looking at our maps to understand, yes, this can actually be here. And finally, detailed layout is flags spaced in the ground in close proximity, but also a detailed, and I'm loath to say specification, but schematic maybe, just so that I'm not calling it a specification, but this style of trail, dimensions, say this wide, of this difficulty level, with this style of trail tread. And then finally, construction, which can be broken down into a few different phases. Again, totally arbitrary based on your local terrain and context and everything that you need. But from corridor clearing to finishing the trail tread, even just enhancing a trail with new features can be included with tread construction or finishing. So don't concern too much with what falls into what category here, because we'll take a look at how to describe the work so that you can get a useful proposal or quote from the contractors that you're trying to engage with. And then there's also some specialty work. There's a number of firms who will specialize in a certain style of work, helical raised boardwalks through wet areas, paved pump tracks, any number of other kinds of features that a firm might specialize in, and you would say fly them from somewhere to provide that service for you. And there's a few things to consider with that as well. So hiring a trail contractor begins with an understanding of what it is you want. And maybe what it is that you want is something that you don't have a clue. You want something cool. You don't have the skills or the expertise to really come up with a detailed list of what it is that looks like. So we can be asking the trail contracting community, we've got this land, what should we do here? That's a reasonable thing that we can be asking. Once we figure out the components of the project and the scope, then we go to determine, okay, well, how are we going to buy these services? What's the best way we can do that? And there's some considerations we'll talk through here. And then this is where it's unique in Canada. When you're contracting with a contractor and you're going through an RFP or an RFQ process, you're actually engaging in two contracts, and they call it Contract A and Contract B. Contract A is a contract that arises when you receive a bid from a proponent, and you are required to evaluate that proponent's proposal according to the guidelines and the language that you set out in your RFP. And so that process includes the invitation, the evaluation, and then the negotiation and award of that. And I have negotiation and RFP because that's exclusively usually in the RFP. And then following that, we have work start, management, evaluation of the product, the work end, and then delivery, final handoff of the product. And so these are generally the steps that we'll go through. And based on the contractors that you're working with, they will have either from a really extensive knowledge of this process and the tools to use in order to be the best bidder, or maybe they don't really understand at all, and this is something new to them. And there's a variety of things we can do to help them along if we so choose, or to exclude them if we don't feel that they would make a good proponent to work with through the process. So the statement of work is what comprises this project's components and scope. And this is a detailed understanding of what it is that you are trying to buy. And it usually begins with a purpose statement. The purpose is to design and build a set number of trails in a given area of such and such a style. And then the scope is what and I forgot my pointer here, so I'm going to grab that. The scope is what outlines how that purpose will get completed. So that can include either some detailed understanding of, I need a green trail that goes from here to here, and there's some specifications here for the contractor to meet an overall grade of X% and a maximum 5-meter grade of percent. And this is arbitrary, intentionally arbitrary as a way that something could be measured. And depending on the type of project or the type of things you're looking to buy, these will all change depending on how much it is. It can be simply a linear amount of trail, or perhaps it's a bike park and it's going to be built in square meters, and therefore you can look at, we want a bike park to be roughly this large with these styles of jumps, including easy difficulty all the way up to hard difficulty. When writing the project scope, you really want to focus on measures that you can use to influence the final outcome. So they need to be measurable. So having something like blue trail doesn't really do enough to describe what it is you're looking for. Perhaps blue trail would then refer to some guideline that says obstacles should not protrude more than X amount from this. This is a way that we can actually say, well, is what you're doing, is that a blue trail, or is that a flow trail? And somebody tell me what a flow trail is in detail, then we can talk about how we can say whether something is a flow trail or not. And that's a real challenge when it comes to trails. A lot of The contracting background comes from more of an engineering focus where we're dealing with robust specifications, but we're looking to inject a little creativity in that. So we're trying to both retain the creative process when it comes to the people we're looking to hire, but also make sure that we've got enough standards and controls in place that we're getting what we want. We want a jump that is going to work for the trail speed, for the users that are going to use it, for the local liability landscape. Those are the challenges. You also want it to be observable. If you want to specify a French drain with a minimum X amount of rock, well, how are you going to know unless you watch that contractor put the rock in the ground? You're not going to dig it out to measure. So the measure, and this again is an arbitrary, I've never heard of anyone specifying that, but maybe a depth would be a better measure. But you do need to be able to observe and measure that outcome. And one of the key things is you are getting a what? You are getting a final product. You're not telling the contractor how to do that. We want bench cut trail. We don't want you to move the soil in such a way, and unless you have specific environmental requirements. But moreover, you generally want to allow the contractor to provide their expertise to give you the final product using all of their expertise. That's what you're looking for, is to rely on their expertise in the long run. So project scope is very important to get defined, and we're just going through some of these statement of work components. The location, the time period, the schedule of deliverables. So X trail will be completed at such a time. Any standards should be included that need to be met. And that varies from province to province. It could include things like insurance. That can include any certifications that are necessary if you're tree falling, if there's environmental standards that need to be followed. Those should be included in the statement of work. And then finally, the payment schedule, which is how is the contractor going to get paid, and how often are they going to get paid, and who signs off on those processes. And that's something that is important to get right, because especially if you've got an early project in the season, you want to make sure that you're getting the work completed, and then you're quickly paying your contractor so that they have the funds to continue. Maybe it's a lean time of the year and we want to continue them getting paid. That's what helps move work forward. So making sure there's a good payment schedule that's detailed and easily understood so that the contractor can orient their work in such a way as to make that payment schedule work for them. Including things in the statement of work that you hope for them to agree on, for the contractor, the winning proponent to agree on, will be things like the legal terms, including privilege, and that's in particular relates to the RFP process, giving somebody the privilege of deciding whether they're going to engage in a contract after the process. Ownership of the final product. Sometimes when we buy designs, we don't own the designs. We only lease them, or I'm not sure exactly, but we don't actually own them in the end. That is retained by the contractor. Any indemnifications that you would like them to have for you, reps and warranties. How long can we be assured that your product will stay in a certain condition? And then any liability and privacy terms that you want included as well. And here are some examples of standards, certifications. If you know you're going to have something in detail like blasting, then you should probably include that in the statement of work. It helps to set out ahead of time what it is that you're looking for. And that's the end of that part. So the main way that we purchase work, the main processes that we will purchase trail work in Canada is through either the request for proposals or request for quotations. And they're both have their strengths and weaknesses. Requests for proposals offer a lot more flexibility. Requests for quotations are where you have already a detailed understanding of what it is that you're trying to purchase. So the scope of work might not totally be predetermined, but the scope listed might be, let's determine the scope of work, or let's have the proponent as part of their proposal determine what that scope of work should be. And it's not a tender. That's a legal term. So that means it's not an RFP. It's a request for, sorry, it's not an RFQ, it's an RFP. It means that we have a little bit more control over the evaluation criteria. And that could include some fully subjective evaluation criteria. You can evaluate a proponent based on any terms that you decide, and you can let them know exactly how or what criteria you'll be using. You can come up with a matrix if you so choose to weight different categories based on emphasis you'd like to place on a certain one. The owner has greater privilege, so we can go through the RFP process, and the owner can decide to do more things than with an RFQ. And there are typically greater costs for the contractor to prepare an RFP, because not only are you asking them how much, not only are you asking them what we're looking for in the RFQ, but you're also asking them, what should I do here? What's the best thing? So we're already engaging their expertise and trying to figure out what the best outcome for a given area is. So this is the trade-off for the flexibility, is the higher costs, because a good contractor will be working to roll those costs of developing the proposal into the cost of the final project. So you will tend to get higher costs overall from the request for proposals. Request for quotations, the scope of work is predetermined, so X amount of Y type of trail, X number of bridges of Y type, and maybe there's detailed drawings to identify exactly what it should look like. Exactly here and exactly like this. So there's not a lot of flexibility in coming up with a different product in the end. It should be exactly what it's listed here. We're finding that this has an objective evaluation criteria. So we're evaluating here based on dates, prices, and professional qualifications, basically meeting mandatory minimums, and then from there, it's price and date performance usually. There's less privilege, so we have less opportunity to negotiate or make changes, but it's easier to prepare. It's a lot easier for the contractor to come up with a quick idea of what it is that they're what it would cost for them to do it, and then the winner is chosen typically based on cost, but it can be by other things as well. So some different ways that we can structure the work, structure the contract so as to purchase things. And this is not exclusive, but this constitutes kind of a majority of the types that we see. There's lump sum, which is a fixed price for the completed project. It's turnkey, here's your trail, and this is how much it costs, and it doesn't change based on that. It's predictable. You know how much it's going to cost. But because that predictability usually means that it's going to be a higher cost, any risk that's built into completing that project, i.e. weather delays and unexpected terrain challenges, or anything else that can substantively change the project, a contractor who's risk averse will be thinking about those risks, and it'll be included in the price of the project. So it's good for small projects with fixed deadlines, but because we're just saying this costs this amount, there's low accountability in terms of the cost. We're evaluating the final product, of course, but there's no opportunity to measure, well, how much did it actually cost you to build all of these things? So if we're looking for accountability in the final outcome, the lump sum isn't the best choice. Time and materials. This is essentially a unit price for time plus the cost of materials. It's not accountable to productivity, which means that we have no way of measuring how productive the contractor is. So is there necessarily an incentive for them to produce a lot of trail in a given day? Not necessarily. So one way to manage that is with a not to exceed limit, where the contractor is bound to produce X amount of trail in this amount of time, but it won't go over this amount. We can guarantee that it'll be done by that. Because we have unit prices for time, if we want to increase the scope, we can say, oh, well, you've already given us a unit price for time. How much time do you think it would take to complete this project? This additional project that's not in the original scope, they can provide you that number and you can move forward. And finally, unit pricing. This one can be the most challenging, but for large projects, it could be the most rewarding. This is cost per unit of measure and not a time unit of measure, but for example, $25,000 per kilometer of single track. In this instance, you know exactly how much the project will cost in the end because you have an idea of how much trail you're trying to purchase. And maybe that, maybe that does change based on recommendations to alter the trail, any kind of change orders that would require a change in the amount of trail, but it's pretty flexible for the contract owner. But that extra risk is typically taken up by the contractor. So you may find that the pricing is somewhat higher for a project that uses unit pricing because of that. Some of the benefits are that it's accountable to cost, but it requires detailed units. So what a kilometer of single track is a very broad term. A kilometer of what kind of single track? And do we have the right tools to communicate the terrain challenges? Do we have the tools to communicate the anticipated overall difficulty level? And how much that costs will totally change. And because of that, it's complicated to bid. There's a lot of risk that the contractor is taking in coming up with a unit pricing bid. And so that you may find that some of the less sophisticated or less experienced contractors are going to have a harder time coming up with a competitive bid. It can be a little bit intimidating depending on who you're working with. So these are some of the pricing options, and these can be broken down into different phases that are part of the project. You can have one part of it be lump sum and then time and materials for another. There's options for going with different approaches depending on the phase of the contract that you're working with. So some considerations of the RFP versus the RFQ process, and this is request for proposals and request for quotes, just so everyone's clear. The RFP allows for flexibility, and we can go through multi-stage RFPs where perhaps you qualify a select number of proponents based on their experience, and then you go back to them afterwards to discuss more in depth, or you request more proposals from them about what should we do in this given area. And that can significantly limit the amount of time that it takes to evaluate. That can make sure that you're respecting the time of the contractor, which is important at this stage. You can have in-confidence discussions with RFPs. And that means that you can receive a bid from somebody and then turn around and ask them for more information. You can say, well, okay, what would it cost for this? Or what do you think about this? You can do that in Canada with the RFP process. And you can also simultaneously negotiate through the RFP. So you can, as long as you are retaining confidence and fairness, you have a duty of fairness to this, you can negotiate with more than one proponent through this phase and then move to award after that. So it's very flexible. It also allows for creativity. We're trying to retain as much creative outlet as we can when purchasing trails, because it's not something that's moved to the fully engineered stage. Maybe bike parks are sufficiently detailed and designed at this point that could be the case. But really, we want to make sure that the creative vision of people who we're hiring as experts is retained as much as possible. And so the RFP process can help with that, because we can use their expertise to inform the scope. So it includes negotiation, but because we're asking them what to do, it comes with a higher cost. For trail construction, trail contracting generally, the RFQ process is probably more appropriate for simple construction projects, something that's easy to determine ahead of time. It provides really good value. And in Canada, it tends to exclude negotiation. So if you go to the winning bid on an RFQ process, and we don't really see this in trail contracting, the trail contracting sphere, because the dollar values aren't quite the same as it would be in a capital C construction contracting. But in that landscape, if the winning bidder was unable to move forward with the contract, then the owner would be able to go after it through a bid bond with the bid bond security. So those are some of the differences. RFPs are made up of generally these components here, and depending on the contract, it can vary greatly. So bid open closing dates, what it is that the contractor must include in order to be what's called responsive. So a responsive bid is one that meets those mandatory criteria. Non-responsive bids must be excluded. So you must include your firm history, you must include your certifications, you must include an organizational chart. Those things would be sometimes included under a mandatory response. The project overview and scope, the service schedule with dates, any supporting data, that's typically attached as an appendix item. Maybe there's been past trail reports that have been done by other firms. Those are the things you would include there. And that informs a statement of work. And when we include things like the bid opening and closing dates, the mandatory responses from the proponent, and then things like on-site meetings, the evaluation criteria, and the draft contract, that forms contract A. So this is the contract that you enter into an agreement with the proponents, people who are bidding to propose to do your work. And when you enter into this contract, you have to be careful because you have a duty to treat those bidders in a fair way. And so that includes things like excluding non-responsive bids. You cannot award a contract to a non-responsive bidder, say they missed a date. That would be unfair to the other proponents. And that is something that the courts have decided arise from contract A, which is something that you enter into. Some other things to include, and we'll talk about those, any on-site meetings that happen and whether those on-site meetings are mandatory. The evaluation criteria, so this is a description of how you're going to treat that firm. And a draft contract, you can include that to find out from them, is there any information, is there anything in here that you disagree with? And when you're working with government entities, they'll often include a draft contract and there's no real room to wiggle, especially when you're a trail contractor, because these are pretty small projects compared to what they would normally buy. But this draft contract with the Trail Association, that can totally be up for grabs. So you can offer to edit that draft contract with more favorable terms if you want. So what do we want trail contractors to include in their proposal? The proposal generally is a narrative for how the work will be completed. That includes, importantly, their approach and methodology. So they might describe some principles that they use to lay out trail. Are they using LiDAR in order to come up with detailed designs ahead of time? Are they doing environmental assessments, that kind of stuff? How will they be building it? Will they be using excavators? Will they be using skid steers? Is it hand labor? Those are the items that will be included there. And then this is an important part as well. Firm history, who's going to be working on it, some past examples of projects that have been successful. This, I think, is important to get right, where you're asking for past examples that are similar to your current project. If you've got lots of rock work, then you'll probably want to know that the proponent will be able to handle that. What's their experience with rocks, with any kind of mechanized rock tools? You'll want to look for something like that. And then references, and then performance as well. We want to know, are you generally meeting your targets when you provide quotes? Are you generally going over, going under? This can be useful information. And you can ask for a few examples. I wouldn't go through too many because it can be cumbersome for smaller firms to come up with that. And so what should we include based on our project? Well, who do we think is going to bid this job? If it's a really large scale job with a lot of potential profit for different companies, maybe we'll get a lot of bidders, but maybe that's not the case. So let's make sure that what we're asking for ties in with who we think can do it. And we'll talk a little bit about different profiles in a minute. The weighting criteria, that can limit your flexibility, understanding your project size, risk and complexity, and just their understanding generally of trails and mountain biking in particular is something you'll want to know. So evaluation is the next phase. First, we remove all non-responsive bids. This is important because we have a duty of fairness, and we're just describing the process for discussing and optionally awarding, maybe by a scoring system or whatnot. And this can be a two-part process where you have, and I have that detailed here, a 2-envelope process where you're weighting their performance first before understanding how much it will cost, and then you can review the prices based on that. So some considerations of the evaluation stage. The assessment of the project is something that can happen during the pre-proposal bid visit or pre-bid visit. We can make it mandatory in Canada. You can say you must attend this session or your bid is non-responsive. I think that's different from our counterparts in the US. By asking them to come ahead of time, we can discourage low effort bidders, people who wouldn't be interested. Don't make this too cumbersome though. If somebody's coming from a ways away, or you're trying to get somebody, maybe it's not a really close drive, having that mandatory pre-proposal visit, if there's flexibility there, that can really help them understand the project while also making sure you're not limiting them from participating. So you can use a 2-envelope process with a matrix, and then you can weight it based on different criteria you think is valuable, past experience, firm qualifications, whatnot. And you want to think of what other mandatory proponent qualities, including professional certification, if there's anything out there that your project has a lot of. After that, you've entered the negotiation phase. So you've evaluated all of the proponents, and after eliminating all of the non-responsive bids, you've evaluated the remaining, you've chosen one, and you can begin your finalization of the scope and price, which can be a multi-stage process. So you can have a first phase RFP and then a second phase where then you're actually only getting a really detailed response from a few firms that have met your initial criteria. Those in-confidence discussions are simultaneous negotiations. And then award. So the RFQ is selected, automatically enters into the agreement. So when that proponent bids on an RFQ with the price, then and they meet the other mandatory requirements, then they're the first step. They're the ones that go ahead. So that after that phase, the work starts and the management of the contract begins. So the first thing that typically happens is there's a startup meeting, and that startup meeting will detail any number of information that's important for the contractor to know. Perhaps some changes have happened in the meantime, and that's a good place to start discussing those. And that can be maybe the first change order that happens. Any safety procedures that the contract owner would like the contractor to follow while they're on site. For myself, when I'm doing trail layout, typically that means I'm contacting one of the representatives of the entity that I'm working with when I start and when I finish, because I'm working alone typically. And we'll also have the identification of the team. And this is where we set out the authority of who can make changes to the contract. And this is really important because sometimes changes need to happen quickly in the field. And it's important that you understand exactly who can authorize a change. There's 4 main people in this phase, and there's kind of mirrored on both sides. There's the contract owner. That would be the entity or the contracting agent in charge. Maybe you never see that person. The contract representative, that's the person that a contractor will deal with. Or if you're administering the contract, that might be you. There's the contractor, which is the person who's entered into the agreement legally, and you might not see that person either. And then there's the contractor representative. That's the person who's out in the field. Maybe they're the ones in charge of that local area project, and they can authorize changes. And project management includes the acceptance of work. So following up with inspection and ensuring that it meets the criteria that you've got set out in the statement of work and under the scope. And this should happen as frequently as possible. It's pretty hard for a trail association to get daily inspection, but for other entities, it might be possible for that to happen. But maybe weekly inspections are something that can happen. And you can make sure, especially at the start of the project, that everything is going as you expected. And there can be a lot of kind of awkward conversations in that phase when you're trying to really get down to, okay, well, I thought it was going to look a little like this, and maybe a change order comes out that identifies exactly what that's supposed to look like, and then everybody's on the same page. You can identify problems, and you want to do that as quickly as you can, especially because if it's machine building, it takes extra time to move that machine back and forth. And while it might be something that's the responsibility of the contractor to fix according to the contract, you don't really want them to have to lose money on the project in order to be successful. You want to help them as much as possible so that they work out, that they have a profitable time when they're working for you, and that you get what you want. And so the inspection rate of the project can really help with that. And that falls under quality management. And then the other thing, one of the main things that happens is with project management phase is change orders. And this is a change in the scope of the project. And the three key components of that are price, scope, and time. So you can offer just an extension. You can offer a change in price, but probably because of a change in circumstance or some other reason, or a change in scope. We want more trail. You're probably not reducing the scope, because that's something that's important for the contractor to retain, because it's part of their bid. So the consideration is important in the contract. When a change happens in the contract, or when a contract is drafted initially, both parties must gain something. So when the price changes or when a scope changes, there should be a corresponding change on the other side. You want a written record of that happen, and that can be an email easily. And you want to ensure that whoever's giving the request for that change, that they have the authority, or that the person you're telling in the field from the contractor, ensure that they have the authority to agree to a change in scope. Responsibility of different site conditions at the time is also, I think, something that's not very commonly understood, but the contractor is responsible for the site conditions at award. And that includes anything that may be hiding beneath the surface of the soil. If there's tons of rock and you, as the contractor, thought that there were going to be easy machine building, that is their responsibility to understand. And that's one of the things that's useful in making a mandatory site visit or awarding weight to site visits, because then you can ensure, hopefully, that they've done a good job of understanding exactly what it is that they're going to be building in. They should be able to come up with a better price after having seen it. The contract owner is responsible for events during the course of work. So wildfires, weathers, conflicts, any kind of changes that were not part of the original site. And so having an understanding of productivity and weather and recording that information down can be really useful, so you can keep on track of the contractor. Following up is key. So some examples, and these are hypothetical examples. They can look way different in the field, and maybe at the end they look totally different too. But one would be a design build one-stage RFP, where one firm is awarded the design and the build of the project. So the phases of the project will allow for conversation in between for refinement of scope afterwards, so that the firm will go out into the field and they will design. They'll look at what is available and existing, and they'll come up with recommendations. And then the contract can include a set of options that the owner can come up with, and then the allowance for the owner to reject. So no, we don't want that, but we want these other things. And then that design document, once it's accepted, can form the basis for scope. And this can be a nice way to get a whole bunch of trail done and really maximize the expertise of a firm that has a lot of experience in doing this kind of stuff. They'll be able to ensure that the design actually makes it through to the construction, which is something that may not happen with a two-phase. They can, when they're designing the trail or the other features that are there, they can write it down in such a way that the person who's building it ensures that they make it into the final product. And so we're allowing maximum creativity and impact in terms of quality. So it allows a firm creative control. It may not provide the best construction price, but it might be the easiest way to do it. It's a large and complex project typically, and there's a lot of unknowns at the beginning. How much trail are we actually thinking there's going to be? We may not be able to understand that. But a long-standing relationship with the contractor is of a benefit. So once we make it through the design phase, we're often already on good footing. Lots of conversations have happened, expectations are set, and we have a good idea that we're going to get a high-quality project in the end. So if you have some firms nearby that have a known reputation or quality, this is a good way to structure the project if you're looking at entertaining them. There's a good amount of profitability built into these kinds of projects for those firms if they're doing everything right. So it can be a really good approach if that's the type of firm you're looking to incentivize to bid on your project. So how does the payment structure work, and are they incentivized to design more expensive trails? So long as you're paying attention to the various options that are proposed in the first phase, and you're asking lots of questions about what that will entail in terms of costs, you can come up with a process that ensures that you're not second guessing whether you're getting more expensive trails than absolutely necessary. And having the cost estimates provided in the design build phase is also useful to control that. Another example would be a request for proposals on design, and then taking that document and requesting quotes on the construction side. We allow for design flexibility because we're using the RFP process, and we have pricing control for construction because we're soliciting quotations from different companies to provide that final product. And because of that, it is simpler to bid for construction firms. So if you're looking to entice somebody who maybe they've got good trail experience, but they're not as sophisticated when it comes to putting in really complex proposals for this kind of work, you can probably get their attention by structuring it this way. Some considerations: you want to make sure that the design components are there. Turns and dimensions and final product and berm insloping. You want to make sure that the design document that was created is detailed enough that there's a really good chance that that final product will turn out as the designer intended. Remember, compared to the last one, there's a disconnect between the person who's designing and the person who's building. And that's not necessarily so. You can actually have the same firm win the RFP and then win the RFQ. In fact, they're really well suited to that because they really understand the project and they've been talking with you about that. And that's something that is fair under the duty of fairness that you have. So you're taking a risk to get a bit of a better price in this one. Project management options include, actually, if you do have a different firm, you can have the firm that designed the trail be the ones that manage the construction and ensure that everything is up to standard. We've done a couple where at least we were involved on some conversations at the front end to make sure that everybody was on the same page before taking more of a hands-off approach following the initial construction component. And then another one would be an RFQ plus a volunteer build. And this is something that happens a fair amount in smaller communities that don't have access to large pockets of money to buy wholesale trails ready to go. This is appealing on the front end, but I caution people to think about the actual benefits versus the expected benefits, because there is a possible lower cost, right? Because the contractor's doing a lot less, but their contractor fixed costs might not be changing a whole lot. So as a percentage, you might not be lowering the overall project cost as much as you think. And it may be better off to get them to just complete the trail completely at the beginning. But it can also extend productivity. Maybe you want to trade the finished product with that trail contractor rough constructing a significant more amount of trail. And that might actually bring you a significant decrease, not in the total cost, because that would still be a little higher, but that would be an increase in their productivity. They'll be able to get more trail done. You'll probably have mixed results depending on the contractor. There's a risk associated with letting somebody else finish something that your name is on. And as much as you can say, once I'm done, people will always know that it was that contractor that built that trail, and they don't have control of what the final product looks like. Or if they try to retain control, they're acting on the whim of volunteers in order to get the product up to their standards. So there's probably a couple conversations that need to happen to make sure that this is something that they'll look to do. And finishing machine-built trail, it kind of sucks, actually. It takes a lot of work, and it's repetitive, and it often involves most of the same thing. You'll see a lot of volunteer burnout. People will be very excited on the front end, and maybe the number of people who come and join you or the length of time they stay goes down afterwards. So be wary of this, but know that it is an option, or at least it's something to consider if you are going through the process of buying some new trail. So there's kind of four main, and I mostly pulled this out of my hat. I guess it's a little bit arbitrary, but I think it brings up a couple patterns that are important to consider when you're going through the RFP process, and ways to manage these typical things. So these are the four main types, and we have rider-built companies, so people who started off building trails because they love to mountain bike, typically. There's engineering architecture firms. These are firms that are full service. They're used to providing engineering services. They're very good at bidding. They're very good at project management and ensuring that they are making a lot of money. There's the local with excavator. This is somebody who sees an opportunity to expand their current skill set. They are not a rider necessarily. Maybe they ride, but they come from an excavator background, not necessarily a rider background, and they're not an engineering or architecture firm, so that they kind of stand on their own. And I think there's an important way we can include them in the process. And finally, there's specialty firms, so people who will just build bridges or just bike parks, or they'll just do maintenance, and some ways to think about that. So, we have a background now. Some considerations for rider companies. They probably have a strong understanding of the user wants, which is really key, because this can be very hard to communicate. So you can relieve yourself of a lot of stress knowing that the person who's out there loves what, and I'm assuming you're all mountain bikers, but loves what you love, and will be able to provide that. Or at least they have the capability to provide that, and we'll use some other tools to make sure they can. They'll be able to measure as much as we can measure subjective performance. Does it flow? Is it fun? That kind of stuff. With some things to consider, what is their experience in terms of contract administration or management? Do they have the skills, and do they have the position in order to accommodate significant changes along the way? Are they proficient with typical contracting procedures, legal terms, stop works, and defaults? These things can be scary when you're first learning it. And a lot of people who start off as rider-built companies, they start doing it and they learn by doing. So there can be a steep learning curve. And depending on the company that you're working with, they're at various levels of that learning curve. And for sure, some of the ones that have done the most work there's no concern with any of this understanding. Same with this kind of expertise, their environmental understanding, structural stuff. Do they understand when to engage with an engineer? Do they understand how to engage stakeholders if this is a master plan session? Rider-owned companies, so some tools that we can use to manage them, clear performance terms and performance that's tied to a payment schedule, and that can be based on trail characteristics. And this circles back to a well-written scope that clearly demonstrates exactly what I mean when I say I want a flow trail from here to here. Maybe it is a certain average grade or various other measurements that we can use. Regular inspections of the work to make sure, okay, maybe they do a really good job of what they do, but are they overstretched with other projects on the go and they're not able to dedicate the resources necessary? Maybe there's some inspection related components that can hopefully help you retain control of what that final product looks like. Ensure that they understand the responsibility. So if they get into trouble with terrain that they did not anticipate, understand that, okay, well, this is something that it was your responsibility to understand. You want them to know this ahead of time. It's probably not fun to learn it on the go. So ensuring that that conversation takes place or is well written in the RFP. And the pre-proposal site visit can really help with this one. They can see, oh, wow, you mean it is really steep. Okay, because people mean different things when they say it's steep or it's rocky or what have you. And they might be operating under false assumptions. Engineering firms, they have good experience under contract and project administration. So bidding, resourcing, managing, they might have an entire team dedicated just to bid, and you'll get a really flashy, really well documented template that says this is exactly everything we're going to do. They'll throw the sink at it. And they have full service capability with GIS, environmental drawings. They can often bring in a lot of really detailed expertise if your project is necessary. But do they, is that more than is necessary? Are they giving you more than what you need to finalize your product? So I'm going to go back one because that's listed in here. So some considerations: do they know what makes a good mountain bike trail? I think the important thing is that they're not just going to resource one of their landscape architects to design the trail, because that's a completely different way of designing trails. And it works fine if you're designing a college campus or some other kind of very front country, more landscape focus, but we want to make sure that the quality fits with rider expectations, with user expectations. And that comes down to engineering versus creativity. Are they going to engineer the entire trail, or is there somebody that can inject creativity into the landscape? Because we could come up with engineered drawings for every single section of trail, but it would be so prohibitively expensive, I don't see the value. So we need to retain that creativity because of that. So do they have that understanding? So let's make sure that they're demonstrating that past experience and the domain generally. Do they understand trails, first of all, and do they understand how to execute a successful trail project? So if they're doing a master plan, are they hearing from all the different types of mountain bikers? Because of course, as we all know, there are many different kinds of mountain bikers, and maybe it's important that we hear from all of them if we're doing a master plan into design, into construction kind of project. Maybe what they'll do in order to raise their profile, if we have some kind of criteria in the process, is they'll try and find a firm that specializes in trails. And this can be a really successful way of getting a large trail project, because you'll have the prime contractor, the engineering firm, doing a really good job of managing all of the contracting style or types of the project. And then the people with the trail experience can provide that input where necessary. But that's certainly going to cost. That's going to cost more than it would be just to get a single firm that has the capability. You want regular walkthroughs to evaluate the subjective quality. And of course, I put subjective quality here, but you'll need to turn subjective quality into a quantitative measure, because we cannot enforce a scope that includes a subjective evaluation. You can't say you must build a fun trail. You have to do that through some kind of scope that allows you to have that. And retain tight control of scope to reduce cost and ensure quality. You might not need all of the stuff that they're proposing for you to do. So ask those questions about what it is that they're saying that they're going to do. Considerations, local with excavator. This is probably my favorite. This is somebody who has an excavator, they've done a lot of work, and they think, I'm going to go do this other project that's way out there. And I admire the tenacity. But you can imagine that there's a few things we need to make sure are squared away before we say, yeah, okay, here's the keys, go to town. And he brings this gigantic excavator into the woods, or she. Typical benefits, a low proposed price. Maybe that's because they don't understand all that goes into it, hence the triple asterisk. A vested interest in community reputation. I find that these types of bidders often just want to work locally. Maybe they're looking to branch out. So are they willing to learn new techniques? Do they understand the scope? Do they have the capacity to fully serve the statement of work? And these can be developed through these can be done through the RFP process. So definitely, if you're expecting to award, or you want somebody like this to win, to be the proponent, a mandatory pre-proposal site visit. Do a walkthrough of everything, and maybe they'll have a lot of questions. You'll be able to gauge based on that. Evaluate, how will they resource and execute? You want to make sure that they appropriately understand the amount of work. And sometimes we get excited seeing a really low number, but a really low number worries me more than a high number, because it tells me that maybe they haven't anticipated all of the things that they're responsible for. So you can actually, through the negotiation phase, say, we want you to come back and think about these items and come up with a different number. You can do that with the RFP. You're holding their hand a little bit. Now, why are we doing this? Why are we helping this person along? There's a couple reasons. One, maybe we're trying to get this person to learn and understand trails, so that we have a local operator who can come out on a moment's notice to just build a little bit of trail for us. That can be a lot more inexpensive compared to a more full service firm who would be interested in doing a lot more based on travel expenses and whatnot. So let's try and figure out their capacity to learn and to grow and to do things in a new way. But you'll want somebody with the contract owner who understands trails and what it means to operate with an excavator, and what it means to build trails with an excavator, because it's very different from building a slab. And it's also a little bit different from how we build with hand tools. As you can imagine, the mess you can make is far larger, far quicker, and almost impossible to fix. So that inspection on the front end, being on site for those inspections, maybe you're there for the whole week helping them kind of move forward. So make sure they understand their responsibilities, and maybe really consider whether the risk is worth it. Consider the project, make sure it's something that is reasonable for somebody who's still learning that domain. You do want them for their excavator experience, but maybe they can be pushed along. And then finally, specialty firms. So these are people who are highly skilled in a narrow scope. They're typically efficient, and they're typically expensive for that reason. You'll probably bring them in from large distances away, because there are not as many specialty firms as there are general service firms. And you'll want to understand that the price does reflect the skill set, but it also might be less expensive depending on your project in the long run to work with a specialty firm, because it might take a general service contractor far longer to complete that project. And then also consider the travel costs and other logistics that maybe they don't translate. And maybe you're bringing somebody in from outside of Canada. You'll need to make sure that they understand all of the nuance in building things in Canada. And that can be a lot, depending on the province especially. So you'll want to understand, okay, they're coming from far away. Well, what's your warranty to the product? We're spending a lot probably to get this. Let's make sure that it's something that they will stand behind. Evaluate travel costs versus the cost of the project overall. This is something that kind of crops up make sure you own what you want to own, and that's okay with you in the end. Maybe you don't own the plans. Do you own the specifications so that you can give them to somebody else to maintain, or is that proprietary? You want to make sure that you can do that. Detailed and clear scope is also something that before the expensive travel cost portion happen, you can make sure that they understand absolutely everything. They're giving you the best possible price from afar. Notice that there's no on-site meeting. If you're flying somebody in from across Canada or from abroad, you probably aren't going to get that phase if it's mandatory. So definitely consider what that would look like for you. And that's everything for right now. Does anyone have any questions? I like your comment on the volunteer offer value. Do you make sure you sign off on a spec ahead of time when or a trail ahead of time, and then the volunteers do their thing after, and or do you follow up after that?
Okay. Usually what we try to do as much as possible is to have the volunteer work with us at the same time, train them at the same time. That way we will generate the skill set we need to maintain the trails or the bike park, but we don't account them as a requirement to complete the job. Right. So we'll bring them on board, put a supervisor with them for as long as we need. So we'll usually try to plan for maybe one foreman to work with the volunteers on a few specific days. And most of the time it will be maybe 1 or 2 days across the job at most. We just completed a fairly large bike park in Ottawa. We had 3 work days. The locals were there. They completed less than 120 hours, while they were expected to do 800.
Yeah. Thanks.
So it gives you
and so you complete the project and volunteers are there. Is the volunteer component part of the scope, and is that priced out separately, or is that included in your general?
Most of our RFP will consider the volunteer as part of the job. My bid usually exclude them of the construction process. If we have volunteers, it will be added work or added features or extra TTF or something like that. But it's not a requirement to complete the job.
So that's good. So adding volunteers costs more than, eh?
Yeah, it's usually it's more expensive to train and work with the volunteers than do the job ourselves. Yeah. It takes more times. We need to provide all the tools, all the equipment, and quite often we have to go back behind them to complete and fix a few things.
Yeah. Good. That fits nicely with how I said it, I think. Yeah. Volunteers get in the way. And the PTBA certification. So I didn't give this any time in the workshop content here, but yes, there's the PTBA, which is the Professional Trail Builders Association, and that's the only certified trail builder in North America, worldwide, Jerome?
Yeah, actually, yes.
Yeah, and so you can list the PTBA. The PTBA would love for you to list the PTBA as a certification, and there is a value in that for sure. You want to make sure that the scope of what you're doing means that somebody from the PTBA will be able to bid on your project. If the project is small in scope or value, you may not get a PTBA certified person bidding on your project, because the coverage in Canada is getting a lot better, but it's not 100%. Is that right? Is that right?
It's getting better. Right now we set about 12 or 15 contractors in Canada, so not that many. But that being said, we do a lot of project supervision for other contractors. So other contractor will just simply call us to work with them as foreman or as project supervisor.
Mm-hmm.
So case by case, of course, but most larger scale project, it's quite often now a requirement to be, or at least a project manager, to be PTBA certified.
And just so everybody else knows what a large project is, what's the value of a large project for you?
It can be in number of committer, or the speed you need to complete the job, or the complexity of it. It can range from 5 to 50 kilometer of trails. It can be large bike park, large being over $500,000. It can be, we did some very complex work in rocky terrain where a general contractor will not be able to tackle that kind of stuff. It's just too complex.
Yeah.
So it's really a case by case.
Right. And just so people who are thinking about the contracting phase and whether the PTBA is a requirement or what have you, with the evaluation component, you could say that while it's not a mandatory, you can give extra weight to PTBA certified builders. So that might be a way for you to get the value you want, or to entice people to be as professional and certified as possible.
True. If you want to add one more thing to the presentation, is to add maybe a separate project supervisor that will, or to sign off at the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
Quite often, especially on larger project, what we see is to have a secondary firm that goes in the back to just validate what the club cannot really, or doesn't have the resources to evaluate.
Mm-hmm.
Just to ensure that what will be delivered on site is actually fit what was expected or requested.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's a good point. I think knowing that you're going to get something that matches what you want to get is key.
So you would recommend having a second firm come in after hiring someone to kind of double?
It can be just a weekly or bi-weekly check, maybe just a few hours to do a follow-up every X time, or maybe 2-3 times across the job at the end of the job. Quite often what we'll see is we'll do the startup meeting with them, and they'll show up 2 or 3 times across the job and come back at the end of it. Also case by case, because usually when you can actually show that the contractor have the skills required to complete the job, quite often the client will simply drop that point, because it's quite expensive to have that.
Okay.
If it's small club that you don't really have the resources to ensure and validate and confirm that everything that is delivered on site is actually match what you need, or if every single bridge and feature is up to specs, then it might be a good idea to have somebody like that to come over and do that kind of stuff. That's something we do in some case.
And then requiring the PTBA certification, or at least recognizing that would be.
It will alleviate the risk with having a Joe Bobcat to show up on the job.
Okay. Yeah, we want to slim down who would be applying right away, and I think that seems like the best way to do that, to get rid of people that don't bike and get engineers.
Depending how the specs are written, you can usually say quite easily which bidder is a writer and which one is not. Just by reference, you can go with that. The contractor must have completed at least 3 or 5 jobs similar to what you want. So pretty much like AJ told before. It's a fairly common practice to see that. Another point, AJ, you haven't talked about bonding, contract bonding.
Yeah.
Most small contractors don't have the resources to put large bonds. If you want to put that, it will most likely be insurance bonding. So you can expect 3 to 5% extra cost on the job because of that.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good point. Thanks, Jerome. Any other questions?
How far in advance would you start putting, if you're going to put a bid out this winter, like, I guess, what is a normal contractor's availability window? Are you looking a year ahead, or are you looking 2 years ahead nowadays?
It depends on the scope of work. But in my case, large projects are booked almost 2 years in advance. And
Okay.
we keep smaller job, like under, I will say under 100,000. That's usually the stuff we keep in between the large job.
Okay.
Disclaimer, I'm the owner of Centre Boreal. I'm a contractor based in Quebec. We built about 700 kilometers of single track so far, worked on 400 projects. I have 21 employees.
Okay. Awesome.
I'm also sitting on the PTABA board, so that's why.
Were you the president, or no? You're no longer?
No, I'm just board member.
You're just board member, right?
For the last 3 years. A really, really small project, if you just have 1 or 2 kilometers of trail, quite often we can squeeze that in between 2 big jobs, because 1 kilometer of trail will take just a few days or at most a week to complete.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, we're looking at a 20K system with a bike park with the budget of $1.5 million.
So you can expect at least a year in advance.
Okay.
If you want to have good bids, yeah, at least a year. Anyway, the RFP, RFQ process will take a few months just by itself.
What's the best RFP versus I guess, how would you decide between going through the RFP or the RFQ for someone who already has a master plan developed and kind of has had someone come and plot everything out?
Well, in my case, I don't even bid on RFQ because it blocks our creativity too much. I have a team of artists, and they tend to prefer to work with RFP, where we can actually showcase what we can do.
Mm-hmm.
So the only RFQ we bid on this year, we've managed to flip the project into an RFP instead.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks, Jerome, for providing your insight. This is one of the most prolific builders in Canada. It's super valuable for everybody here and for anybody who watches this after. So thanks very much, and for your comments about what to include on the next part. And thanks. Take care, everyone.